Scientific Writing Best Practices is an instructional presentation brought to you by Dr. Joshua Paiz in cooperation with the NYU Shanghai Writing Program. In this vidcast, we will discuss some best practices for use in scientific writing tasks, and along the way we'll provide some examples of these best practices. Good scientific writing is usually predicated on what Harvard cognitive scientist Steven Pinker refers to as plain style. Here are 3 hallmarks of plain style: audience-appropriate word use, concise sentences, and logical organizational patterns. Let's dig into each of these a little bit more. The lexical decisions that you make while writing should always be appropriate to the audience for whom you're writing. Take these 3 example sentences. What can we infer about the lexical decision-making processes of the author? One thing that we notice is that they become increasingly wordy and jargony as we move through the list, replacing simple words like food with more specialist terms like nutrients. When it comes to scientific writing, economical use of language showcases your skill as a proficient writer. This means, quite simply, don't use 10 words when 6 will do. This doesn't mean that all of your sentences must be short sentences. If you use only short sentences, your paper will read like an action sequence in a Stephen King thriller. Or it'll look like you only understand simple sentences and simple thoughts. Likewise, if you only use long, complicated sentences, your reader will question whether or not you'll ever actually get around to making your point, or they might think that you have something to hide. Take a few seconds to read this example, considering if and where you might cut down on wordy expressions. The original was a bit wordy. This slide shows a few possible revisions that are much more concise while maintaining meaning. Take a second to review the changes. There are certain things that you can do to write more concisely. First, be sure to omit needless words. This can be done by avoiding unneeded hedges. A hedge is when you soften or distance yourself from a claim. Also, be sure to stay away from ineffectual phrases like "as a matter of fact," "as regards," and "it's interesting to note that." Second, give a strong preference towards simpler words, avoiding jargon wherever possible. John Lynch said it best when he said that bad writers consider long words more impressive than short ones. Third, prefer simple subjects. Scientific writing abounds with complex subjects. The biggest problem this creates is increased distance between the subject and the verb. Often, scientific writers want to accomplish too much in a single sentence. They want to define a complex, abstract entity, the subject, and then describe something that it does. Instead, it is usually more clear to split these tasks into multiple sentences, some to define the subject and others to define what it does. Often, complex subjects encapsulate action in a modifying phrase. Here's an example. Note that the complex subject has been underlined. Can you think of a possible revision? Here's one likely candidate as a revision. You'll see that here their strategy was to break the original into 2 distinct sentences, one focusing on the subject of the sequences and another on the resulting alignments. Finally, be sure to use modifiers like adjectives and adverbs sparingly. While IMRAD gives us a paper-wide uber-organizational pattern, inside of paragraphs there's a more useful one called the given new pattern. In this sample paragraph, you'll notice that things seem to jump around a little bit and that there's little in the way of clear logical connection between the ideas. By using the idea from the previous sentence as the lead-in to the next sentence, the given, we can logically extend this idea, the new, in the latter half of the new sentence. This pattern also helps to create highly cohesive reports. Take a second to read over this revision to see how the given new pattern can be used. Said another way, you should seek to avoid zombie nouns, verbs that have been turned into nouns. Some examples include regulation in place of to regulate, analysis in place of to analyze, and delineation in place of to delineate. Can you think of any more? Putting action in verbs is important because the average reader expects for verbs or predicates of a sentence to contain information about what was done. When we use nominalizations, the zombie nouns, we violate this expectation. Here's an example. This brings us to the next principle. Put agents or doers in the subject position. This means, wherever possible, write in the active voice. The exception to this is when the result is more important than what was done or to whom it was done. Certainly, in scientific writing, passive voice is permissible. However, it should only be used when needed. As a matter of fact, many major scientific journals encourage potential authors to use the active voice whenever possible. Principle 3 is to keep subjects and verbs close together. This is because the average reader can be easily distracted if you put long strings of extraneous information between subjects and verbs. Take a look at this example. What's this sentence about? Can you figure it out if you give it a quick read? If you had trouble, it's because there's a lot of extraneous information here interrupting the connection between the subject, the farmers, and the predicate are in high demand. How can this sentence be improved? Take a look at this revision. You'll notice here that the subject and predicate are much closer together. After this is given, the specifying information then appears as part of the sentence complement. Scientific writing, like all writing, takes time and effort to become good writing. With practice and by keeping these best practices in mind, you can increase your proficiency in writing for scientific purposes. This has been a presentation of Scientific Writing Best Practices brought to you by Dr. Joshua Paiz in cooperation with the NYU Shanghai Writing Program.